The envelope I found on my desk one Wednesday morning was a deep, rich violet, and the paper was soft, almost leathery when I picked it up. In the always dim light of the newspaper office, I could see the reflective glow of gold foil letters. The text was simple. You're invited. Now, if you're anyone else, this might be a pretty cool thing to find on your desk. Nothing like an invitation to a fancy party or an exclusive club to break up your typical workday. But the sight of this envelope filled me with apprehension. An invitation is never just an invitation in Habitsville, and yet I opened it. Inside was a metallic gold sheet of paper with scrawling, looped writing that read, "A guided tour of the Habitsville Heart Museum." Below it was tomorrow's date, and a time, 3 o'clock in the afternoon. The Habitsville Heart Museum. I had never heard of such a place. I asked around the office, but everyone seemed just as clueless as I was, even Heather, who covers the arts and culture column. It was seeming more and more like a prank. After all, there was no address on the paper or the envelope. Sort of invitation doesn't include a location, so I let it sit on the corner of my desk the rest of the day. When it came time to close shop, I put it in my jacket pocket and resolved to throw it away once I got home. But like the various wrappers and loose bits of paper that also lived in my pockets, it was forgotten. So there the invitation stayed. I didn't waste time pondering it that night nor the following morning, and by the afternoon of the next day, I just forgotten about it entirely. Until around 2:30 p.m., when I began to hear it. Bum, bum. At first, I thought the pulse was my own. I was working on a fairly boring story at my desk, practically dozing off, when it settled lightly in my ears. A slight thumping, like a distant drum. I tried to write through it. Maybe I was getting another migraine, or my blood pressure was high. But soon, the rhythm became distracting because of one disturbing fact. This heartbeat didn't match up with my own. It was much heavier, slow, and as I became more anxious, the dissonance between the two speeds grew. I looked around to see if anyone else seemed to be hearing it, but the few other people in the office appeared unbothered. I stood up and walked over to the office door, trying to spot an outdoor concert or a car with a bone-rattling bass, but all appeared quiet out on the street. Although when I moved closer to the door, the beating in my ears grew ever so slightly louder, as though coaxing me forward. I took another glance around the office. There was no suspicious glances turned my way. I could see through the glass that my boss was stuck in another all-day meeting. And so I slipped out the office door. Walking through the streets of Habitsville was a trial and error. As I lurched forward towards the sound, the drumming pulse led me down alleyways and past unfamiliar shops and houses, growing quieter with each wrong turn and louder with every one that got me closer to, well, I wasn't sure what. Eventually, I ended up at an impasse. The beating was at its loudest volume yet, but there was nowhere else to go. I was cornered in a truly decrepit section of town. I half expected tumbleweeds to come rolling by. The drumming in my head had faced me with two unappealing options. On the left was what seemed to be an old hat shop. Not old like the 1950s, old like the 1850s. There were dusty hats stuffed with feathers and taxidermied animals behind a filthy pane of glass. And on the right was an ice cream parlor with a shattered window and a huge novelty discolored cone out front. Neither building had lights on. Both felt supremely haunted. I sighed heavily as the pulsing continued. I leaned to the left, and the sound decreased. I sighed again. Demented, ancient ice cream shop it is. But when I moved to the right, the sound went lower as well. I stared ahead for a moment, confused. It was one thing to be led here by a creepy internal beating heart, But it was another thing for it to be so anticlimactic. And then I saw it. Between the ice cream parlor and the hat shop, there was a sliver of space. It was so slight, too slight to be intended as a well-trodden passageway, and yet, when I took a step towards it, the beating grew louder. I knew I shouldn't go in there. It was just wide enough for me to fit in sideways, that much I could tell, but my brain was adamant that I not attempt to scrape through. No, Sam, please don't squeeze into the tiny dark crevice where your corpse will never be found if you get stuck and die, my brain said. But it would be incredibly out of character if I start listening to my brain now, so I turned sideways and began to shuffle. The space between, to put it plainly, sucked. It was dark, like the sun couldn't reach such a narrow angle, and the brick on my chest and back chilled me through to my lungs. Worse than that was what spread over my hands as I felt my way forward. A viscous fluid that seemed to cover the expanse of the alleyway. The stone scraped against me every time I breathed deeply, and resorted to taking only short, shallow puffs of air. The pulsing in my ears continued, strong and certain as I traveled through the slime passageway. I couldn't make out what awaited me at the end, only that the darkness gave way to a beam of white light, which, unfortunately, is often what people report seeing right before they die. The alley grew just a bit narrower at the end, so I couldn't turn my head, and had to suck in my stomach and hold my breath until finally I was birthed into a section of Habitsville I had never laid eyes on before. Huge brick walls, probably 40 feet high, surrounded this strange, secluded square. It seemed impossible that I had never noticed it before. Logically, it should be visible from just about every other part of town. There was no break in the brick that I could see besides where I stood after emerging from the crevice, as though the tight alleyway was the only entrance to get in within the brick square. And in the center of it all was the Habitsville Heart Museum. The building was grand in every sense. I'm no architectural expert, but it looked more like a cathedral than a museum, with ornate onion domes and towering twisted spires. It was the most impressive building I had ever seen. And there, engraved on a marble plaque over an elaborate carved oak door, was its title: the Habitsville Heart Museum. I stood there feeling absolutely minuscule in the bizarre alcove, listening hard for the heartbeat to tell me where to go next. It took only a moment for me to realize I had been standing in complete silence. I couldn't catch a single pulsing note on the breeze. "Mr. Singer!" a voice cut through the quiet. I turned away from the magnificent structure before me to see a man emerging from the same slight passage that I had inched through. The man was small, at least smaller than me, with a very neat appearance. A suit, with a scratched, patterned handkerchief in the breast pocket, groomed mustache. But he didn't seem stuffy. His eyes seemed friendly. And I finally felt my shoulders relax. The man walked over, his steps echoing strangely against the brick enclosure. He smiled. "You're early!" "Am I?" I answered, realizing I had taken neither watch nor phone with me from the newspaper office. "I just came when I was, called." It was the smallest allusion to the drumming heartbeat that I dared make, lest the stranger think I was completely insane. But to my surprise, he laughed. "Yes, the museum can get impatient," he said. Okay, so definitely not the time to relax. I looked from the slight man to the astounding building, and my hands grew cold and clammy. "You mean the pulsing was coming from that?" I asked, nodding toward the great hulking silhouette of the museum. The man chuckled, his mustache wiggling up and down as he did. "We should really walk and talk, Mr. Singer. The museum was anxious to see you, and it's best not to keep it waiting." He took off towards the tall oak door, and I scampered to keep up with him. The Habitsville Heart Museum is one of the oldest living buildings in Habitsville, he began. I was already at a loss for words. I couldn't pick which phrase was the most alarming. Living building or one of. It's a place of artistic achievement and organic intellect. It's also extremely elusive. Only those who've been invited are permitted to go inside. So far, since its opening, that VIP list has included myself. I serve as the curator, and our security staff, and as of a few days ago, you, Mr. Singer. He smiled like I was supposed to feel lucky, but I couldn't even muster a grimace. We'd arrived at the front doors, and suddenly the man stopped. You don't hear the heartbeat anymore, correct? He inquired, bemused. I listened for a moment, then nodded. It isn't gone. It's simply matched up with your own. That's how you know you're one of the fortunate souls who've arrived at the right place, at the right time, with the museum's blessing. Everyone has the same heartbeat here. He was right. The pulse was gone, but if I was quiet, even held my breath, they could hear it. A second pulse, humming along with my own. The slightest throbbing echo against my ribcage. Right then, the man said before gripping the handle of the door and swinging it open. Let's begin the tour. Hey there kids, it's me, MrCreepyPasta, and I want to tell you thank you so much for watching tonight's video if you're watching on YouTube. Thank you so much for listening to tonight's podcast if you're listening on Spotify, and thank you guys for doing that thing where you subscribe, where you hit the bell, where you hit like, or you leave a little comment at the bottom or wherever you can leave comments at. I don't know, I don't use Spotify that much. And finally, I want to give a huge thank you to everybody who supports me on Patreon. This past year has been rough. I've been gone for quite a while trying to get things organized for my own life, and Patreon subscribers, you guys who subscribe everywhere, this has kept me afloat in turbulent waters. So I want to give a very special thank you to Jordan Humble, Diana Kraus, Disciple, Strategy Wolf Emoji, SullyMan, Brandon Mendoza, BrimstonePandemonium, Caltuna, William Wellington, Scruffy the Janitor, Brenna, LaQueda Canizales, Smiley the Psychotic, Djenna, Dante Kinkade, SimbasBloodyMojo, Mephistopheles, CursepoxPrimarch, M, Jesus Cornejo, Yarghoul, VerbalHorror, Amber Clark, J. Kearns, Mike, himbojerry, CrusaderChocobo, Gordon Dallas, Estebean, Seclude, Salty Surprise, Red Shadowcat, Turtleman, Cryolinian, Mr. Marcus Blitz, Dirt Diver 030, Voice of Sand, Psychomel, Melted Lake, Tali Sue, William King, Sashi Suzaku, Croconut 509, Stricken, Freddy Krueger, Hades Nephew, Acid System, Sky Harbor, Nico Kyle, The Ginger Bros, Aaron Stormcrow, Daniel Polson, and Corey Kenshin. I really appreciate your support, and I cannot thank you enough.